Have you ever found yourself holding a drink in one hand and a dinner plate on the other while you're watching TV and sitting on the couch with no place to put it? You certainly don't want to set it on the cushion. I've got the perfect solution, and it's a sofa table. It slides underneath the couch and provides a very stable, durable surface to put that drink or put that dinner plate. The nice part about this project is it's got a lot of different joinery. And what I'd like to do is highlight the joinery along with the glue that you use in those joints to make for a strong, stable base like this piece of furniture has. We have tongue and groove, we have end grain on face grain, we have edge grain on face grain. I've got a solid wood glue up on the top and a floating panel on the back. All different types of joints, different ways to clamp them. We'll show you different glues to use on them and why we'd use one over the other. I think you'll find that it works really well in combination with this table and that project. Once you get done building this, you'll have not only a great addition to your living room or to your den, but you'll also have a better understanding of how glue works, and especially the joints and how that glue works with those joints to provide such a nice piece of furniture. It's easy to build. Let's get started. To begin, we're going to cut both the rails and the stiles on the table saw. Now the rails and the stiles on the bottom support and the top are all 2 inches, so that's why we're going to the table saw. We will then go to the miter saw and cut them to length. So once we finish those 2 operations, it's time to go to the router table and do the tenon. This is a mortise and tenon joint, fairly common joint, but I'm going to give you some of the tips and tricks to use to make that a perfect joint, and you'll see why. This is the mortise and tenon joint. Here is our mortise, and here is the tenon. And this is how that joint will fit together. The goal is to make the mortise first, and you always do the mortise first, and I'm doing that on the router table because that's the simplest and most accurate way to do it. First, I want to make sure that the mortise is centered on this piece of stock. And by taking a piece of scrap, the same thickness as the material we're going to ultimately route, I'm going to keep testing that fit until I'm happy that it's centered between those 2 edges. The length of this mortise is 1.75 inches. So I set a stop block from here to the outside edge of that router bit to show 1.75 inches. And I finally raise the bit enough to cut the full depth of that mortise. And finally, the stop block is raised a bit off the table because this generates an inordinate amount of sawdust, and that would pile up in front of this, which would keep me from being able to set each one of these all the way up to the end. I may have to stop while we're doing it to clear a little bit of this, but the point is that it's high enough up to allow me to cut these. Now that I'm happy with both the height and the length and the spacing of this, I'm going to route all 8 of those mortises. To make the tenon, I'm using a rabbiting bit. I've set the rabbiting bit so that I can make one pass on this edge and one pass on this edge to create the tenon, and I'll slowly raise the bit to make that tenon fit perfectly. I've continued to raise the bit until the fit on that tenon is perfect. And again, the fit that I want is tight enough that you don't have to pound it on, but not so loose that when you pick it up, it falls off. That type of fit allows a perfect glue joint since the glue needs something to bond to. And here's the last operation on this. I have an 1 3/4 mortise length, and I have a 2-inch tenon. I'm going to remove a little section on this corner at the bandsaw so that when I reinsert that, it's nice and smooth at the back and it covers any potential opening here. I'm cutting this tongue away so that it fits well into the mortise. This is the time to take it slow and easy because you want the cut to be perfect. I'll make the same cut for all 8 tenons and then clean that edge as necessary. Now I'm going to start by gluing up the bottom support. And remember, the strength of this joint comes from the smoothness of the face of this tenon and the inside edge of that mortise, and a fit that when it goes together, I don't have to force to get it together, and it's not so loose it would fall apart. So that's the key to this joint. Now I'm going to spread glue on the face of that tenon and inside the edges of that mortise and put this entire joint together and then clamp them. As I use clamps to tighten up this joint, I'm only tightening those clamps until the glue line closes. I'm not over tightening because there's no reason for that. And secondly, I'm going to use a small framing square just to make sure that my joint is square once the clamps are on. Don't be concerned that your mortise and tenon ends aren't perfect at the ends of your glue up. Just a quick pass on a table saw will clean up those edges beautifully. Using the same rabbiting bit set up on the router table as we did the support rails, now it's time to create a tongue on the top and bottom supports on one edge. Finally, we'll trim off a little bit of the tongue on both the top and bottom supports. Next is making the braces, and the process is pretty straightforward. I use the table saw and the miter saw to create 4-inch by 4-inch blocks. I then used a piece of MDF to create a template with a 3 1/4-inch radius. I transferred that radius to each of those 4 blocks and cut the profile out on the bandsaw. And finally, I used a drum sander to clean up those bandsawn edges. If you don't have a drum sander, don't worry about it, just use a hand sander. Making the panel back here calls for material that's 1/2 inch thick. And you can either buy material in 1/2 inch thick, or you can buy 3/4 and plane it down to that thickness. Take a little time as you're going through the material, and you may get lucky like I did. I found some material here with some awfully nice straight grain to it, and it will make a really nice project. But digging a little deeper in that same pile, I found something with not only straight grain, but some really pretty figure. Both of these would make an excellent panel in the back. This is just digging a little bit and found it. So once I've got my 1/2 inch material, I have to make these lines meet perfectly, so I've got to joint them. And I can do that either on the table saw or the joiner. All I want them to do is fit perfectly. After looking at these 2 sets of boards, I chose this one because it just seems to match a little bit better with the grain. So I've got a couple of clamps. I've used some wax paper to protect the table and a couple of pieces of tape to protect the clamps themselves. And now it's time to clamp these up. A couple of things real quickly. I want to make sure that that seam matches perfectly, that there is no light shining through it, so the clamps are just holding it. I want to put glue on one surface only, like so. And I like to use my finger. It's the only tool that I know I won't misplace. Now clamping these up, I'm going to go from one side to the other. I'll make sure that the seam is even here, and I'm only going to tighten the clamps until I see the joint close. I'll do the same here. And lastly there. It doesn't take much pressure to put those boards together. They met really well to begin with. It only takes 150, 175 psi to do that. These clamps will generate many times that. All I have to do is close that seam till the glue shows and I'm done. Once I've done that, you'll see the glue popped up here. There's 2 methods to take glue off. This is my favorite and, to be honest, the most effective. I'm just going to use a damp rag and remove the excess. These clamps are nice to use because I can turn it on its end and I can take more of the glue off on this side. And the second way to take care of glue squeeze out is to wait until that glue kind of gets to what I would call a popcorn consistency, and then use a putty knife or a chisel and scrape that glue off and then follow it up with a damp rag. Both methods work really well. I prefer wiping it off right off the bat. Last thing is, I can remove these clamps, depending on temperature and humidity, in half an hour to an hour. But it's going to take a good 8 hours for this to cure really well. So take that into consideration when you're working on a project. The more you rush something, the more you tend to make a problem. Giving this a chance to dry completely and cure completely is a good thing. Creating that back panel assembly, as you see here, calls for 1/2 inch solid wood, and you've seen me glue that together. So at the table saw, I'm going to cut this to width, and I'm also going to cut it to length. This also has the stiles and the rails here that also have to be cut to width, and they're all 2 inches. I will do that at the table saw as well. And to cut those to length, I'm going to go to the miter saw. So those two tools will do all of these different cuts, and then from there, we do the joinery, and that's at the router table. To cut the back rails, I'm using the same bit setup, this rabbiting bit setup that we had before, but I'm going to take a piece of scrap and I'm going to try this first to make sure that my cuts on either side make for a tenon that will fit into that mortise. And again, this is all part of that previous scrap. So I'll make a couple of passes on this. When I'm happy with that, then I'll bring the back rails in here and do those real quickly with that setup. And now a quick trip to the bandsaw to trim this edge off like we have in the past. We'll finish the construction of these back rails. Cutting the tenon on this back panel is just a little bit more involved. I'm using the same rabbiting bit that I did before, but I've changed the bearing on it from this larger one to something slightly smaller, so I get a 7/16 of an inch depth. I only had 3/8 before. And I've lowered that bit, so by routing one side and the other of this by about 1/8 of an inch, I'm creating a 1/4 inch tenon, which is what I'm looking for. So I've set the bit lower than I think I really need it. I'm going to make a pass on one side, then flip it around to the other, and then see how that fits. Doing the first sample passes, I'm raising that bit incrementally because I can't add material back that I've taken off. I'll continue to raise that bit and check my tenon's thickness against my sample piece. Once I'm happy that it fits well there, I'm free to now finish routing the balance of the sides. In order to insert the panel into the rails and stiles, I need to have a groove around the inside edge of all of those pieces. And it needs to be 1/4 of an inch wide and 3/8 of an inch high. So I've installed the bit to do that, and I'm going to go back to my tried and true scrap piece that I've used to set up all of these operations, and I'm going to make sure that that bit fits inside the scrap piece and the fences align perfectly. So once those are set, I can now put the groove in all of those pieces. I've done a test clamp just to make sure that all of my joinery looks good. And we want to make sure that we always do that in any project that we do. But now it's time to turn your attention to the panel. This is going to expand and contract with seasonal changes in humidity because it's a solid wood panel. If I'm planning on staining this, the suggestion is to do that now. That way, any expansion and contraction will be uniform and you're not going to see any open lines. You can also think about putting a finish on for the same reasons. It allows that finish then to withstand any drops of glue that may come on here while you're doing your assembly. That's the time to think of this. Once you've done that, it's now time to do the glue up. As I'm assembling this, I want to make sure that I've got plenty of time to align those different edges. Secondly, I want to make sure that the glue that I apply to the mortise and tenon is kept away from the inside edge of that joint, so that no potential glue squeeze out will compromise the panel's ability to expand and contract with changes in humidity. I want to wipe each one of those joints of any of the glue squeeze out. It is much easier to do that when conflicting grain directions would cause a problem if I waited to scrape it. And lastly, put a square on it and make sure that you're happy with the square. I've done that. I'm very happy that this is going together exactly as I want, and now the glue just needs to set and do its thing. Well, this is our completed panel, and I really like the way it turned out. And now what I want to do is provide grooves at the top and bottom edge of this panel on that same side that will ultimately allow me to insert the tenons on the support panels on the bottom and the top. So I've inserted a 1/4-inch router bit. It's a 1/4 inch away from the fence. I'm going to plunge my panel into it, which will start 3/8 of an inch away from this corner. And I will continue to this side and end 3/8 of an inch away from the corner and pick this up. That'll provide the groove here, and I'll reverse it to do the other side. To make this all but foolproof, I've added a stop block on both the right and the left. So by plunging in on the right and moving to the left, I provide the perfect stop without going too far in either direction. Now that the router work is done on these assemblies, it's time to glue them up. But before I do that, I spent a little bit of time with sandpaper, just making sure that all of the edges are nice and smooth. It's going to be really hard to take care of that after we start the assembly. I'm adding glue to the tenons first, and then the mortises. This joint doesn't take quite as long to put together, but since I started with Tight Bond 3, I'll finish that way. It gives me plenty of open time and assembly time to do this. I'm putting the clamps in the position that you see them. That provides a more direct line of pressure between each of the upright and the horizontal stiles. I'll check for square to make sure that the clamps are providing the correct pressure and not overpressure. And lastly, I just want that joint to sit for a while. It needs to set up for 15 or 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, so I can reverse the process and do the opposite side. It's now time to install the braces. These are going to give additional support to the vertical style and the horizontal style. And notice the way the grain is oriented. In this case, I have the end grain up against the face grain here, and I have edge grain up against the face grain there. Because end grain is an inherently weaker joint, not only will I glue this, but I'm also going to set 2 screws from below to give it additional support. The edge grain up against the face is an exceptionally strong joint, so I really only need glue for that. So I'm going to position each one of these and screw them in place. I'm pre-drilling holes for each one of the braces, and I'm not terribly concerned about the little dimple. That will actually keep sawdust from impacting the fit of that brace next to each one of those stiles. Now I'm applying glue on both edges, both the end grain and the face grain, sliding them into place, making sure that they're centered on the stiles, and then clamping them in place. Now I'll turn it over, and using the same countersink bit, I'll provide the perfect holes for number 8 by 1 1/4 inch screws. And lastly, I want to wipe all the glue off each one of those pieces before it sets. I'm using a rag here, and I'm also using a screwdriver. I kind of like to get into those little corners, and the screwdriver does a really nice job for that. Now it's time to make the top for this sofa table. And this is kind of the showpiece of this project, and I want it to look absolutely perfect. So the material I select is important. The first thing is, if you're thicknessing your own material from something a lot thicker, take your material down to within 1/16 of an inch of that 3/4. That way, once your joinery is done, you can send it back through your thickness planer or drum sander to make it perfect 3/4. This is store-bought material, and it's already 3/4. Take the time at the store to make sure that what you're buying is perfectly flat and straight. This is not the time to find something that has a slight bow or a twist and think you can get it out of there, because you can't. You don't have that thickness to play with. The second thing is, I want to make sure that these open lines that you see between these boards are eliminated. And I can do that in either operation of the table saw or the joiner. There are clamps like these that I can use and literally pull that joint together. But doing that creates an inordinate amount of stress at the top and the bottom of that board that forever will be asking that glue to keep that joint together. I want to make sure that I eliminate that opening so that the boards fit together so perfectly that the clamp just holds them in that place until the glue sets up. You have to trust the strength of the glue. The glues are strong enough that when that joint is finally cured, the joint itself, the bond, is stronger than the wood itself. You don't have to worry about it ever cracking or coming apart. And the reason is we provided a perfect joint and we provided just enough clamping pressure to hold it until the glue does its job. Those things will make this board and your project more successful. Now it's time to go and create that perfect joint. So my first step is to lay out the boards in the color and grain direction I like. And I've kind of played with them a little bit until I get something that's very pleasing to me. Secondly, after I've done that, I mark the edges with X's and O's. You can use 1-1 or 2-2. I like to use X's and O's because I love my work. But this way, when I start jointing these, I want to make sure that the 2 X's have a perfect joint. And then I move on to make sure that the 2 O's have a perfect joint. And finally, when I take these back to the table, realigning the X's and O's will tell me what orientation, what direction, and what edges fit together so that what I did at the table saw is exactly what I'm going to clamp up at the work table. My last quick check is a visual one. I just put the boards together and with hand pressure see whether or not I can see light through the joint. If I don't see light through the joint, it will be perfect once it's been glued up. The clamp up now is pretty straightforward. I put the O's and the X's together. I protected the workbench with a couple of pieces of wax paper and the clamps with a couple of pieces of painter's tape. By putting the clamps on, I start at one end and tighten them until I see the joint close. And you'll notice that the glue is squeezing up from there. And as I move from right to left, I keep tightening those clamps until the glue line is perfect all the way across. Now it's time to wipe down those joints, and I've done that on the front and the back. That way this gets a chance to sit without any residual glue sitting on the top. This now needs to sit for half an hour to 45 minutes before I can remove the clamps. But to be honest, I'll probably leave the clamps on there for a while until the glue gets a good chance to cure. I just pulled this top from the clamps, and after a little bit of sanding, looks pretty good. The joints have all but disappeared. So now the goal is to square this up. I'm going to cut a little bit from each edge to make sure that my center stays centered, and then I'll cut the board to length. To add a decorative edge and to also lighten the look of that top, I'm going to cut a 22-degree pass on all 4 sides. I'm testing it to make sure that the cut is correct, and I'm also interested in leaving 1/8 of an inch straight at the top of each edge. Once I've determined that the cut is in the correct place, I cut all 4 sides. To mount the top, I'm drilling holes in the rails, and while drilling, I'm rocking that bit back and forth, which will give a little bit of clearance for the screw as that top expands and contracts. Now I'm aligning the top and adding clamps to hold it in place. From underneath, I'm drilling countersink holes for the number 8 by 1 1/4" screws. Now this is our completed project, and I do believe it's going to be a great addition to your living space. We've given you the tips and techniques to create the joinery. So it's time to get into your shop, make this project, and the next time you sit on your couch, you'll wonder how you ever did without it.